Hi Ryan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hey, folks. Uh,
Good morning. Hi, everyone.
Demi.
Good morning.
Welcome, welcome. Nazima said that he may not join today, but it is, as usual, being recorded for posterity or what have you. Oh, he's here. Hey. So Ryan, I'm just gonna let you take it away.
Okay,
And
can I have screen sharing
yeah,
abilities?
sorry,
No, you're
forgotten.
good. Um, hopefully. Okay, let me put this in. So I sent the slides in an email. I can put them in the chat as well, but they should be in the meeting invitation today. I didn't plan we should get to know you. What I would love instead is to provide at some point during the talk some critical feedback or questions or something like that, and maybe we'll dedicate the time to that. I would really appreciate that on my end. So I've just titled this governance task updates, and what I wanted it to do is use this time to like reflect a little bit on where I'm at with the parts of our project I've been working on, and get some feedback on where I should go with it and how I should be better spending my time. So that's my goal for today. I actually wanted to start by bringing up like the task from the proposal that I've been working on. So I pulled this straight from the proposal task text. I think it's like task 2B, I believe. But so we said we would extract company records and organize them by parcel, use content analysis, supervised learning, and structural topic modeling to characterize key features of rules at the neighborhood, municipal, and regional scales, and then characterize rates of change. The results will be compared with existing policies or incentives in other locations. When I look at this, it's a little bit of a panic because this is like a lot of stuff going on in a few sentences. So like, what does this mean to me? I tried to make a chart to say how I've been thinking about this. So I've been trying to think about it from two perspectives. One, we need to think about rules and institutions that might shape adoption or behavior change or any sorts of change at the household level. And then second, we need to actually think of measures of that behavior change. So on the left side, we might have different rules or standards or codes, or what I generally think of as institutions, things that are structuring behavior. And then on the right side, we have our measure of outcomes. And I've been generally using there is parcel level permit data. So one thing I wanted to do is walk through like each of these sides, what I've been working on. One of the themes is going to be I have pretty good effort on the right at this point, and we need to put in more effort on the left. And so I'm hoping that part of what we can do today is help direct that of like, what should we be looking at as far as institutions? What are things we think might matter? Okay, so I want to start with the adoption behavior. So many of you know I've been looking at parcel level data. We started looking at Pueblo parcel data. We used those for sampling for Chris's interviews he was doing. So that's pretty much how we've used those. We have one paper that we've used to try and look at installer certifications that we can talk about later. But I've also been working on the Denver County parcel data, and that's actually what I want to talk about mostly today because I think it'll give you a better window into what's going on with this data and how might we use it in a way that's maybe different from the Pueblo case we often talk about. So what is this Denver data that I'm going to talk about? So essentially the way I built this is initially, when we submitted this project, I thought we were going to be able to download it all from the internet. From the time that our project got submitted to approved, Denver changed their system for managing this. So what I ended up having to do was I submitted a public information request. So I essentially FOIA'd the permit data from 2018 to 2023. The reason I did that is pre-2018 data is already stored on GitHub because enough people had scraped it in the past that we could already get that data, but we couldn't get from 2018 on with their new system. So I FOIA'd them. I said, hey, I need all of your permit information. What they sent me was essentially numbers of the permits, who the contractor was, what the address was. So then what I did is I used that data to do an internet search essentially. And what I did is I essentially built a robot to go in and scrape permit details. Because what we really need to know is like what are houses doing? It's not just enough to know that a house did something. We ideally want to know, hey, did they make a change? Did they change their bath fans, their water heater, anything like that? And that data is in what we would call like the scope of work on a permit. It's a free text entry box that the contractor says, hey, this is what we're doing on the house. So built a model or essentially a robot to go out and scrape that off the information using that FOIA data. At this point, I've been focusing on only permits about heating and cooling. So I have all the mechanical permits, but there's about 16,000 heating and cooling permits from like January 1st, 2020 to 2023. And so that's what I've started working on because it's a recent period. It's still a lot of data that is enough to process that I feel like I don't need to go back before 2020 at this point. And I think it matches up with what other people on the project are doing as far as their focus on heat pump adoption or other changes related to HVAC better than just looking at all mechanical permits or something like that. I just see there's someone in the chat. And please feel free to interrupt or ask questions or whatnot. Why would these be data on the Why would these data be on the web? Okay, they're they're public information. And this is true everywhere in the US. What differs is that if it's easily available. So like Boulder County, for example, you can do a bulk data download. Denver, you have to go in and scrape them from this Acela database. But this is something that's like true across the US. It's always available, and it's just because of the regulatory system that we regulate buildings by. Yeah, we have age of homes. Where it gets a little weird is we know the original home built date, and then there's also like the county uses what they call like the effective build date. So if you have an extensive remodel to your house, then we might use the effective build date. The stuff I'm going to talk about today, I actually don't use the effective date because I didn't have that until this week because I had to go and get it from somewhere else. All of these databases were stored in different places. And so that was one of the fun projects is learning, okay, how do we take that address data that has that is in the permits and link that to the parcel data that has the effective build date. So what I'm going to present today is just the actual build date, not the effective date. Any other questions before we move on to what do these data actually look like?
I'm curious, like, do they need permits to make changes to heating and cooling? Or like, what is
Yes.
it? Okay, so they cannot just do it, they need like somebody needs to approve it or something. Or like, do we miss any changes in heating and cooling that do not need permits or something?
Great question. So that's the fun part about this in some way is I know there's a missing population. So we know there are people who should get a permit and don't. Like if you're flipping a house, you often have a limited amount of time to turn that over and permits can get backed up. So like famously, people flipping homes won't get a permit. As a policy person, I don't quite know what to do about that because it's technically like what we would call like the black market. Like you're not going through the legal system of doing this. You're not going with a contractor that's registered for the city. That's always going to be unobserved. The only place we could observe those changes is like in a real estate record. So if you were to take like Redfin data from 2010 and Redfin data from 2020, and like you see that the cooling system changed, that would reflect that. But the county doesn't actually have a record of that. I think this is like always a challenge with administrative data is like there's always people going around government. And oftentimes we just say, you know, what we're going to study is people you doing like the legal pathway to change. And we'll acknowledge that there's stuff we're missing. Thank you. That's a wonderful question, though. I would love to know who is not going through the permit system, though. I think that's like one of the open questions of if that's a huge part of our population, we need to know that. So, are there heat pump sales data? I'm going to make a note of that. That's a really good question. One of my dream projects is to be able to get a hold of like Home Depot data, but I don't think
But just to apparently NEMS uses heat pump sales data to determine their retirement rates. So it's available to NEMS. I don't know if they get some special. I mean, things like that Nielsen data that tracks consumption expenditure and sales. I wonder if that's very expensive to get that. There somewhere.
Could we get it geographically? Do you know how geographically specific it is?
No, I don't. It could be just company sales in the country, which wouldn't be that helpful. But I was also thinking what Tammy just asked, that it's interesting if you take 5,000 changes a year, given the Denver population, what percent rate of replacement does that represent? That's interesting.
Can you say that once again? Sorry, my daughter was going by in a cozy coupe and it was really, really loud.
I was just thinking it would be useful to infer a replacement rate in Denver based on these permits. Of course, notwithstanding the black market, 5,000 a year. What share of households are replacing their heating systems, heating cooling systems?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to get into next. So that's what I've been working on the last few weeks is like doing some summary statistics that way. Yeah. So, all right, any questions about basics of what this looks like? And then we can get into, oh, I clicked through to the slides. So all right. So this is the spatial map. So like, oh, where'd it go? So this is like my spatial map of what this would look like. So because this is parcel level data, we can be really, really detailed about like what rates of change look like. So on the left, this is just a choropleth map of like counts of heating and cooling permits over the Denver metro area at the block level. So we can be really, really specific. We could do this at an address. You could make it into like, a smooth point process model. The challenge is like, in some ways the data is so fine grained it's hard to use because we can't use any of like the ACS data or those things on top of it. Ultimately, we have to bin back up to the block group or block level. But as far as like looking at individual rates of change in a neighborhood, we could be really specific and say, if I look at that map to the left, if we look at like the southeast quadrant of Denver, we see a lot more permits there. If you know anything about Denver, like that's where a lot of the wealth is. If you look, I think you can see my mouse. I'm not actually sure how that works with Zoom, I'm realizing. But if you look where the map says Lakewood, and just to the right of that, there's a relatively lighter area. That's probably the densest like Hispanic population of area of the city. So I think part of what's going on here is we have different rates of change depending on income, depending on housing characteristics. There's also some areas that are really, really dark. Those areas tend to be areas with a lot of multifamily or apartment housing. I kept them in at this point, so anybody that was a residential unit is in the sample. Yeah, it could also be different rates of permitting. Good point, Tammy. I'm a political scientist, and so when I presented some of this data to my colleagues, that was what they brought up is, we could have differences in who's actually getting permits. I played with that with the Pueblo data actually a bit, and I was never able to find anything. So I'm curious. Yeah, it's possible I just don't have a good way of measuring that. Okay, on the right, those are densities of heat pump adoption across the city. One of the interesting things we see in this 2020 to 2023 sample is almost no heat pump adoptions to 2020 to lots of heat pump adoptions in 2023. I think it's like, fewer than 20 to more than 200. And so like an order of magnitude change in the number of people adopting heat pumps across the city. It's really hard to see a spatial pattern with what we see there. I think like when I look at that, it's like, it mostly seems like noise across space. That doesn't mean that something else isn't going to matter, but yeah, I don't see a lot there. So this is breaking that down a little bit more with what we see. So heat pumps still, even with, more heat pumps now, they're relatively rare. They're more expensive. So if we look at the dollar value of a heat pump permit, they're about $4,000 on average more expensive than just a general AC permit, which is what the black dots in the background are. I think the thing that I had missed, and I brought this up a little last week until I started getting into the permits, is we might assume that a lot of these heat pumps are actually switching fuels. So we're going from a gas furnace to a heat pump, but that's actually not what I'm observing in the data. And this could be a weird Denver thing. But when I look at the data, what I actually see is a mix of different technologies going on. So this is a tile plot. You can actually think about it as just it's essentially a big contingency table. I'm going to take a second and walk people through what's going on here to hopefully help clarify it because it's really messy to look at. All right, on our y-axis on the left, these are counts of whether people have a heat pump in their permit or no heat pump in their permit. So if you are in the top row on this chart, I did not find evidence of a heat pump in your permit. So how I did this is I essentially took the scope of work and I used regular expression. So if I saw something like heat pump or ASHP or another word that we know would go with heat pump, I said, hey, we see a heat pump here. If I didn't see those words, I said no heat pump. It gets a little bit messier than that because a lot of the permits say what equipment they had and what they're replacing it with. So I essentially created a set of regular expressions that if we see a with, we select the second part of the text. If we see a different, organization, so it selects part of that scope of work, says, hey, do we see the word heat pump, ASHP, air source, something like that in the text. Did the same thing then for whether they had a furnace or no furnace. So a word about a furnace. Some things that I realized popped up with furnaces that never popped up with heat pumps, for example, is sharing like what the efficiency percentage of the furnace was. So if you have a heat pump, it'll show the SEER rating. If you have a furnace, it always reports, is it 80%, 96? Where does the furnace lie? So that actually became a pretty good way of saying, hey, is there still a gas furnace in this home or not? The other thing I broke this down with, so we have heat pump, no heat pump, furnace, no furnace, and then is there AC or not? So this doesn't show up very well in this chart, and I apologize for that. But that left panel are people who they installed an AC, or I see things about air conditioning systems in the permit that wouldn't show up with a heat pump. Generally, that's the word air conditioning or AC. And then on the right are we don't see any, or sorry, yeah, did I do that right? I think I just described this wrong. Well, the other side is no AC. So I then tried to go in and label like what we actually see here. Essentially, we see people installing furnaces and ACs on AC only, furnaces only, other mechanical systems, heat pumps only, and then some things I labeled as noise. What I didn't really expect is, and I want to highlight this, is that 293 category. So that cell there shows people installing both heat pumps and furnaces in the same permit. So they might have an 80% furnace and an air source heat pump. 411 is the count of only heat pump installations I see. So while there are quite a few heat pump only installations, there's just about like 2/3 as many people who are installing a heat pump and a furnace. So what that tells me, it's like incomplete fuel switching. Yeah, we have some electrification, but almost as many people are still having a gas furnace in their home when they're putting in a central heat pump. So it's not like it's complete electrification. It's probably mostly electrification. And then if we have really cold days in the winter, because it's Denver, we're still going to rely on our gas furnace. All right, questions about this confusing chart before we move on?
Yes, Ryan, I have a question. Oh, sorry. Maybe somebody else did.
Go ahead, I'll go.
Okay. I guess my first question is, in each of these blocks, this represents what happened under one permit. So one permit, but for maybe multiple actions.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep. So it's in one permit, we'd see there's an 80% furnace and a heat pump.
Okay.
But go in one permit, and they can say, oh, so that would actually, in the data set, it would be labeled as like a 310 permit and a 313 permit. So we have a cooling permit and a heating permit in the same
Yep.
unit.
Okay. Yep. That's what I understood. Thanks for clarifying. Then Mike, I don't know that I'm caught it. Is noise meaning like you can't classify it? This isn't like a noise, this isn't a change to their home that addresses like noise of traffic. This is like
No,
statistical.
It's statistical noise, so
Okay.
that's like the failure of my regular expressions. What those essentially popped up in is actually part of what it's catching is I was using AC to catch air conditioning units.
Okay.
Sometimes if somebody's doing a heat pump, they'll lump the electrical permit in the same permit, and so we'll see AC show up there because
Uh-huh.
it also had like an AC circuit added.
Okay.
I didn't quite believe what I was finding at first, and so I started going through these and saying like, what is going on? I'm pretty sure that 23 and 19 count. I think those are mostly error that's resulted from like the like just the inability to look at a permit and
Yes.
say, hey, this is exactly what it is.
What it is. Yeah. Okay. And then I have
Yeah.
one third question, and then I'll pass the mic after. The other mechanical is a pretty large group.
Yep.
I think it's the largest. And maybe we could come back to it if it takes us off track. But I'd be curious to know like what you think that's capturing or know that's capturing.
There's a lot of bath fan permits and a lot of
But
water.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's so
Uh,
interesting.
What did you say, Ryan? It's a lot of what permits?
it's a lot of so water heaters and bath fans are a lot of what shows up there. Water
Bath
heaters are a little
fans. Oh,
weird in Denver. Oh, and then Ellison, you'll like
Stove?
this cook stove ventilation.
Cook stove. That's what I was just gonna ask. I wanted to know if cook stove ventilation was in that grouping. It's a little off topic for what we're talking about, but I thought that might be the case.
Yeah, there's also a lot of bath fans installed at the same time someone's replacing their HVAC, which I did not expect, but I see that a lot. And I think it
Yeah.
has to do with like the building codes most Denver houses are under is the
Yeah.
1935 building code, and it didn't require bath fans, and it's the bulk of housing stock. So
Yeah. Got it. Okay. Thank you for answering those questions and putting this.
yeah, I was just really puzzled about this heat pump only versus dual. So on the left block is people who used to have a furnace before, and the right, they didn't have a furnace before. Is that what
no, this
the
is
left?
this is in this permit. What do I see the scope of work describing the contractor is installing? So
Yeah, but you have on the top that says furnace, no furnace. Does that mean because you were trying to describe the two blocks and then I didn't get what?
yeah, I know what I did wrong as I was describing this. So left versus right in this panel is actually AC, no AC. So in each panel, there's AC, no AC, and then on the top is there a furnace or is there no furnace? So we see 2,500 permits in our sample that describe just installing an AC system. Because you could say, hey, I have a furnace. I don't need a furnace. I just need someone to add AC to my house. So we actually see that in the permits. They'll say, hey, we're going to install a 13 SEER AC system. And it won't say anything the furnace versus on the left, that 3,800 is permits that we see someone saying, hey, we're going to install an 80% furnace and an air condenser cooling unit, something like that. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I
So
described this.
none of this is telling you what they had before.
So I deleted the what they have before part. I would say for about half the permits, the scope of work says we're what they're replacing, but it's not there for all of the permits. If it was there, I deleted it for now just because I was trying to get a description of what people are doing. And I think like until Christine's presentation last week, I wasn't as worried about that. Then Christine presented and it was like, oh, what they have before is what matters the most. And so I have plans to go back and get that. I just don't have it yet. So
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it would be great to see if we can see if there's any triangulation with national level survey and local Denver actual data. If there's any alignment in terms of prior equipment, that'll be awesome.
yeah,
But I
there's
was
a lot of missings. That's the one thing to be concerned.
that's
Okay.
just weird. Yeah. Anyway, I was also curious. I may have mentioned this the last time that in Connecticut, there's this old law that you have to have a dual system because the heat pumps at the time couldn't go down to the temperature that you needed. Sorry, it couldn't bring you up to comfort levels from a very, very cold temperature. Um, I'm wondering if there's any such thing in the building codes, but I'm guessing all of Denver would have the same codes. So that doesn't really explain the difference between the 293 and the 411.
No, and like, I mean, you can use electric resistance heating.
Yeah. But you may choose to put a furnace as well if you had it before. That's why.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just wondering if there's something about the regulations that's driving that difference between the 293 and the 411, or if it's just an individual choice.
I will dig into that. That's a really yeah. That's exactly the sort of thing I'm hoping to get from this, because like I think one of my jobs is to look at how regulations are driving all of this. And I hadn't thought about that.
Cool, thanks.
Let me write this down real quick. Okay. I wasn't looking at the chat. I'm gonna make sure there's nothing remaining in the chat. Yes, Kartik. I think we can add those. We can actually have more fun if we want, like demographic data, because like it's pretty near 2020. We can use like the voter file releases, so we can actually use like block level demographic data, and then other estimates we'd have to use at the block or the tract or block group level. Stacy, your question, we could look at that because like, well, we could kind of look at it. So this is a problem Chris and I ran into in Denver is if the weatherization contractor is the government, we can identify weatherization permits, but they do a lot of contracting out in Colorado. I contacted the state weatherization agency to see if they had records of who they contracted out to, so we could like map that onto it. And they were like, we don't keep track of that, which was kind of concerning. The way we did it in Pueblo is I essentially worked through budget documents until we figured out who the contractors were. But if we did something like that in Denver, we could say, hey, based on who the contractor is, we think this is driven by weatherization or not. Okay.
Oh, one more question. Sorry,
Yep.
Ryan.
Yep.
I'm just wondering, imagine if people building an extension to their home, they're adding a room or something, and then, that's why they just add a heat pump for that extra room. I mean, do we know how much of this is, it is extensions in the house? I guess there's so many things one could ask, but I'm just wondering if the reason there's dual systems versus just heat pump is because we're doing an extension to the house and therefore choosing to have a dual system. And yeah, it's just really fascinating me.
I'm going to skip to this slide because I think that might be part of what's going on with mini splits. There are a lot of mini splits that we see in a data set, way more than central AC. And I have a hunch that some of that is driven by ADUs, Airbnbs, things like that. One of the ways I thought about controlling for that is we can look at the permit and we can say, did it go with like an alteration? Like, is there a code for an alteration versus just a repair replace? At this point, I just left everything in because I wanted to say, hey, what does this look like overall? But we could filter by repair replace. We also could use like ADU zoning data to say, hey, once an area is zoned for ADUs, do we actually see different permit adoption behavior? At this point, like I tried that with like basic zoning codes and I didn't see anything, but I'd like to keep playing with that. Because I think there's something about like, is this supplemental? Is it truly replacing? And that'll maybe get at Tammy's point of like, is there like a short-term rental thing here? I mean, it could be very interesting. Like ideally, like in Denver, they're supposed to be registered. So we could look at data of like, if you have a registered short-term rental, do we actually see different installation patterns? I think that's actually something we could map. ADU is accessory dwelling unit. So a number of neighborhoods in Denver are zoned for ADUs versus not ADUs. But I think that's one of those areas that like once we have people's addresses, like sure, let's map short-term rentals onto this and see if we see different behavior at places that are running short-term rentals. I think that's a good question. Okay, some good news. One thing I did with the data is I tried to say, hey, if you're installing an AC or a heat pump, what is the efficiency of your system? Most of the permits say what the SEER rating was. This is like a pretty bad chart, but I had a terrible time thinking about how to graph this. So we'll walk through what this says. So on the x-axis, it's the value of the permit. So the contractor is supposed to say, hey, this is what the permit is worth, what the job's going to cost us. On the y-axis, we have AC efficiency. So those are SEER ratings. As the colors get more visible and brighter blue, they become the year 2013. And then this is mapping the density of points. So what you might notice there, if you look really carefully, is as our years, so we're moving from 2020 to 2023, permits on average are getting more expensive. That's not shocking, probably a lot of inflation in the housing sector over this period. But one thing I was really excited about is we have this pretty clear jump in 2023 in terms of system efficiency. One of the things I think is going on here is in 2023, on January 1st, there was a federal mandate that the minimum AC efficiency needed to be 14 SEERs instead of 13 SEERs. And we actually see that showing up in our data, that the average efficiency of the system increases. I also think there's a contribution of heat pumps here because we see a lot more heat pumps in 2013 than or 2023 versus 2022, and they're a lot more efficient. This is another way of viewing it. So this is like the smooth line over permit values, AC efficiency, and then by year. So if we look at this, we see overall per year, systems are not only costing more, but they're also becoming more efficient. So I think that's a good outcome here that, hey, things seem to at least somewhat be getting better, maybe driven by this federal mandate, maybe driven by more heat pump adoption. I don't know.
Brian,
Yeah.
on that plot,
Which
I'm
one,
sorry,
this one or this one?
not the circle one, the arcs, the one
Yeah.
with the arcs. Can you just slow down just a little to tell me why you see that? I believe you. I'm trying to keep up. You said you see more efficiency even though more expensive.
Yeah, and I think it's like the federal mandate of you're not allowed to install a 13 SEER system anymore. The minimum was 14 SEER. And it was like a calendar year thing, like on July or on January 1st, these need to switch. So
Okay.
I wouldn't read too much. Like to me, like the 2022, 21, 20 mostly look more expensive. Like I think like if we did a test on those lines,
Uh-huh.
might be a difference, but it was really 2023. There was a clear difference in system efficiency on average. Part of why,
Okay.
Why is it
sorry, go for it.
why is it coming down for
Yeah.
higher level, higher
That's
costs?
That's just it's a smoothed fit line.
It's just fewer sample points often does that.
Yeah, and
okay.
actually it does this overall. To me, it looks like there's an effect of like if you have an apartment building, maybe you're installing less efficient systems on average because there's some really expensive permits in there, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if we look at those, it's like I'm buying 10 AC systems. That shows up as one permit because it's an apartment. I think there might be like as you have more units, people are installing less efficient systems. I don't have any proof of that though.
Oh, so the permit
Yes.
value could be higher because it's the number of things they're buying, and because they're buying a higher number, they are willing or whatever, they're choosing slightly less efficient so they can maybe get 10 units instead of 8.
Yeah, I mean that's my assumption, or maybe like this is where I'm not an engineer, so maybe if you're doing an apartment building that actually makes more sense. I don't know. Because
Okay.
like this isn't telling us what end energy use is. This is telling us just what the characteristics of the installed unit are.
Yeah, the SEER value, right?
Exactly.
Does it not include labor cost?
No, it should. So it should be the full value of the permit.
So then the increase in wages could kind of mess with that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
But it shouldn't mess with the SEER rating. So I think
no. The cost of the permit, when wages went up and supply chains went crazy, that's kind of in there. Probably not dominant, but we just have to remember that.
yeah. One of the things I like about this line versus the other line is we actually see that we somewhat have a bimodal distribution as well. Like you're installing a low efficiency system or a high efficiency system, and we see two patterns of practice there. It's not like it's a continuous. It's either like
That's really cool. I like that.
okay. There's bad news as far as heating though. So we see more efficient cooling systems. When we look at heating, 80% efficient furnaces are still like the bulk of what is getting installed in people's houses. So this is like the counts across the sample. Yeah, there's a lot of missings here where people didn't report what efficiency there was. So That's, maybe hopefully those are high efficiency furnaces, but based on the data, my hunch is they are probably also mostly 80% efficient furnaces. And it didn't matter if you install the heat pump. I actually think like this is important because, if you look at the data, there's a lot of 80% non-condensing furnaces going with heat pumps. Maybe the justification there is we're not using the furnace very much, so we might as well put it in the cheapest system. I think if we think about future regulations of like, I think there's been talk like 2028, I want to say Denver wants to make it so nobody can install an 80% furnace. Like this actually is a really major shift if we look at what people are doing now versus what they need to be doing in 5 years. If we look at this temporally, this is the same plot temporally. There's maybe a little bit of change in 2013 towards 96% furnaces versus 80% furnaces. But when I pulled this, when I made this chart in particular, I was still scraping 2023 scope of works. So I wouldn't read too much into that at this point, but maybe a little bit of hope in 2023 versus 22 and 20. But yeah, I'd love to hear any thoughts on Ellison's points, like what is driving the 80% furnace adoption?
I mean, the obvious hypothesis is just low income using less upfront money. You get a cheaper, less efficient one. I mean, you can see that in the data. That's true, right?
Yeah, and it could be something like if you're willing to go up a price point, you get a heat pump.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
So there's just not room for, right, like that. It's not a good, the high efficiency furnace is not a good competitor for a heat pump.
Yeah, if you have the funds to expend on that in the first place, yeah. I see. I forget, do you have the income at the level of the household? I didn't
No.
think so, right? It's just ACS level, right?
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a fun project idea there, but it's risky.
Ooh.
One thing I thought about is like, well, I didn't think about this. Me and some colleagues talked about this as potential because I've been like canvassing my colleagues, hey, how could we better get at housing permit data? And one of the things they brought up is like public employee salaries are available. So like we could do something like take anybody who's a city employee of Denver, map their house, map their salary, and get at that. Otherwise, I think we have to use like what is the value of the home as like the closest proxy. I think the challenge there is like there's a lot of error with value of home relative to income, like it's mostly good, but there is error maybe especially when we get to like vulnerable communities who have, facing gentrification. And so that's a little concerning to me, but it's maybe better than nothing. Tammy didn't
Yeah,
yeah, mapping people's addresses to their salary.
Ryan, I know I feel like I bring these things up, maybe just it's like a well-worn path in my mind. I thought that some of the trouble with home value and income was like the renter owner difference, like the value of the home that someone lives in, if it's not theirs, is more poorly correlated with, or not correlated with, the income level or wealth or whatever term you want to use of the people living in it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole problem here of like, what do we do about renter-owned versus owner-owned homes and knowing what that is. Denver added rental registration. It's imperfect, but I think we might be able to use that to help get at that. I haven't pulled that data. I think we'd have to FOIA it, but we could get it if we wanted it. And it's not a perfect uptake. I want to say when I read it, it was like 60%, but it's maybe better than nothing as far as like getting single family dwelling permitted.
Right.
is there not a strong relationship? I don't know at what spatial granularity, but with geography and average income? The code within the like neighborhoods. I don't know. That's this economist in Harvard, on the intergenerational income elasticity, showed a clear relationship between social upward mobility and geography, but I don't know what spatial scale exactly. And yeah, that's crude. It's crude, but it's
Well, and if
uh,
we at least controlled for like upward mobility, that might help to get it. Because like those are exactly the papers I was talking about as problematic too, or like you don't know what social mobility looks like within a metro region. And that my reading of the econ literature is it's very city dependent. Um, that's a good idea though. Okay.
I think you lost me. What's a measure of upward mobility that you're talking about? Sorry, I feel.
this is really famous work done by this prodigy economist at Harvard, Raj Chetty, who calculated intergenerational income elasticity, like looking at the ratio of your income to your grandparents' generation's income, um,
Oh,
and showed how it maps exactly to like redlining communities, and this was reflecting racial differences across the country, and it's being used widely, even among admissions committees and universities as a proxy for affirmative action.
okay.
But so it's very good analysis, but I don't know exactly the granularity. It goes down as low as Ryan's data, the block level,
Yeah.
for example.
We have redlining data. I'd like to use that at some point, but um, uh, all right. Okay. My screen froze on my side. Sorry. All right, so so that's like my brief like description of like here's what the adoption behavior looks like. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I have or haven't been doing on rules and institutions as well. I think this is the less well thought out part of this, partially because it's been a lot harder to get the permit data than I thought it was going to be initially, just like truthfully. So Pueblo data, the first thing we thought is like we can look at like who is installing heat pumps. And so we have a working paper looking at that. It's at the link there. The other thing I've been trying to think through is like, are what happens like operationalized by the actual contractor? And so building what I've called like communities of practice. And I wanted to like map out how I've been thinking about this because I'd love more feedback on it. I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I at least thought it would be helpful to get feedback on what this looks like. I'm actually going to skip ahead. One of the things I've been thinking about is if I could take individual houses and fit them into bins. And so this is like a rough 3 category bin. But for example, if we say we have a house that's built before 1940, and then we took the value of the house and we took how big that house is. So square footage is on the bottom axis there, value of the house on the y-axis, and then year it was built. And we took all the houses in Denver and we put them into bins, thinking about homes in those bins as we're all essentially one house. And so we could be really, you could be more or less fine-grained about this. So we could say like, well, if we think you're a Hispanic homeowner, your house goes in a bin. If we think you're non-Hispanic owner, it goes in a different bin. We could say based on the number of bedrooms, etc. My first idea for how to do this is to use essentially the categories that ResStock uses. So if we use the ResStock housing categories and we take our data and we put every house into a bin, what that might then allow us to do is to see if different contractors are working with different types of houses. So I've been trying to think about this as not then a regression type data, but like as network type data. This is a terrible Sankey plot on the right following Ellison's theme from a few weeks ago. But if we take like our heat pump installation data and look at what contractors are installing heat pumps on individual houses, I actually think like to me, having looked at the data a lot, this is really striking to me because like Cooper Heating and Cooling, for example, is like by far the largest installer in the Denver metro region. Like if you call Costco and say, hey, I need a heat pump, they're going to send Cooper out. They advertise the most. They're the company Excel works with the most. And they're like a really small player in this market. They're the salmon colored block on the right there. Instead, we see all of these other providers who are doing a lot more heat pump installs. Ones that like I had never heard of. And if I look at the heat pump data, they're showing up a lot. And then we have some of these installers who are only working with certain housing bins. Um, I'm really curious about building this into a larger network data and saying if we place houses into bins and then we look at what contractors are working with which houses, what do we actually see show up here? Part of why I've been thinking about the data this way as well is I had an identification problem. So if we go back to the initial project proposal on the first chapter, the goal was to say, hey, what incentives or policies are driving change at the household level? But within permit data, it doesn't tell us, hey, did they get a rebate for their heat pump? It doesn't tell us, hey, did Excel, inspect and tell them what they should do? It just says, hey, they got a heat pump or they got a furnace. But what we can get are because of the way rebates work, we can look at like company level data and say, hey, the city of Denver issued a rebate to Summit Heating and Air Conditioning. And then we can maybe infer that if Summit Air Heating and Air Conditioning got 10 heat pump rebates and they installed 30 heat pumps, a third of their installations had a rebate. So I've been thinking about using it as my identification strategy as well. Because otherwise we have no real way of mapping incentives onto this parcel data other than spatially. And there's not a lot of spatial variation. I think, proposing the project, I was hoping there'd be a lot more than there is, but most of our counties have the same utilities. There's not a lot of residential rebates that are sub-county level at this point. And so I don't really know how else to get at this because I'm not even sure comparing counties will be an effective identification strategy. So yeah, I'm just curious how people feel about like placing houses into blocks and like mapping network connections through contractors as like my main way of identifying like how incentives and rules are working.
Just to understand, Ryan, your left side are the bins that you
Yep.
just talked about.
Yep.
So that's each of them corresponds to a certain size and income.
Yep. So that would be
size and wealth, whatever.
yeah. So it's
Value.
like how much is your home worth? How big is your home? What decade was it built in? So like H2 I think shows up a lot here. So this is like a lot of the Denver housing stock, home between 300 and 600,000 in value, 0 to 1,500 square feet, and then built before 1940. And like that would then show up in this green bar here of, well, we see these homes are served by these contractors.
Are the numbers with the H, is that the number of homes represented in that bin, or is it the name of the number of the group?
That's just my label I gave it.
Okay, just the label. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I haven't seen this done, and so like that's why I realize this is like I like putting two confusing plots up there, but I want to see if like does this even make sense as a strategy for thinking about like home behavior of like putting homes in blocks like this?
Well, so a question about the blocks. Like to me, this doesn't sound foreign because we do this a lot when we're thinking about trying to understand air pollution impacts of interventions. And at the like level of the study, we maybe have a difficulty teasing out impacts, but as we group homes by stove use habits, like this home always uses this type of stove and they use it every day. Like we end up subsetting our homes by characteristics that unite them and that we hypothesize are maybe going to give us a more clear line of sight into the impact we're interested in. So that's the analogy in my brain right now that makes this seem very similar, but maybe I think I don't fully understand the blocking, that like how you would do your blocking seems like it would matter, but those are my thoughts. I'll stop. I'm sure others have comments.
If anyone has input on that how question, I think that's part of what I don't know is like, what is the way we should do that? Like,
Oh, okay. Okay.
like, because at this point, I'm essentially using what data I have. It's like, how old is the home? How big is it? How much do we think it works? I didn't put this on the chart, but like, do we think it's a Hispanic homeowner or not? I can do bedrooms, but like, does that make sense? Or is that just using, I think Narsima is really good at thinking about that. Is this just like what's easily measurable and should we actually be binning them a different way? I think that's part of my question. Like not just to use what we have, but what should we have? Like, how should we be doing this?
So for me, I think that a question is what effect the contractor has also. And we may not get to that in this next few months, but I don't feel like the questions are separable. How are we binning them versus what are we binning them for? So if there's a quality effect, like you've discussed in the past, Ryan, or there's a selection bias toward a certain kind of system, then I think those things are valid. And the question is how much is it an individual choice and how much is it a contractor effect? So I'm not expecting that you answer that right away, but that would be my goal in, like, how do you go down that path? It's not just similarity, but it's similarity of outcome in a way.
I mean, I think if we built like a network of like, this is what this looks like for heat pumps, we built a network of this is like what it looks like for someone putting in an AC and furnace and compared the networks. If there wasn't a contractor effect, we'd expect them to look relatively the same, like not a lot of differences. But I think like, I haven't plotted this or analyzed it, but well, I have plotted this. I haven't analyzed it. And like, they look very, very different. Like the contractors that show up are very different within those two systems.
So that would be super interesting for me, right?
I'll work on that. Yeah, because I think actually that's like the
I'm
that
giving you more questions than answers.
A couple of thoughts I had building on that is, I'm just wondering, it sounds like you're interested in using the bins to figure out income groups a little bit, perhaps, who the contractors are targeting. And I'm just wondering, the only confounding thing is urban versus rural. If you're in, smaller apartments in urban high rise or something, you may not match up. If you separate this for suburban versus in the city, I'm not sure. That's a confounding factor. The other thing I'm wondering is, can you actually interview these contractors to get information about who their clientele are, or if they operate in certain geographies, and then one can actually get real data that one can include in this mapping?
I think we'd like to interview contractors. I think
that's a phase 2 question.
yeah.
Like we're right
Yeah,
on
for
the
sure.
precipice of this, like this really promising direction.
I guess the question is right now, what's useful to show? That's what you're trying to get at. I really like the idea of going through the contractors because you know what rebates and stuff they use. Yeah, but how do you relate that to the actual customers? I'm not sure.
The weird thing about linking the rates to the contractors is you end up getting like this heat pump was like 0.1 a rebated heat pump. And so like I think it might be a confusing thing to explain to reviewers, but I don't know if there's a better way of doing it that I've found. So and there's gonna be people you model as receiving a rebate who didn't. I should actually mention this. So I did this. I took the rebate data from 2023 that Denver has and mapped it onto companies and then plotted it. And actually, most of the heat pumps didn't have any evidence of rebates, which I was a little bit surprised by because I don't know why you would install a heat pump in Denver without a rebate.
So, you should, I don't know about Denver, but you should talk to Paul about this because people are doing crazy things in Chicago.
Okay.
Like somehow they're playing some game where they're not doing the rebate, but they're saying we'll apply for you. And then they're raising I'm not going to get this right, but they're actually raising the install by the amount of the rebate. And like I said, I'm not going to get this right, but when Paul told me about this, I'm like, that is super messed up. And also, an interesting, I'm not really sure what you would call it as an economist, but it's like some kind of economic response that's logical, but also defeatist of the principle. I don't know if that's happening in Denver. But I think there are games that get played with rebates that we should know about.
I think that's
Tammy,
totally plausible. The moral hazard. I felt that happened to me with a contractor. They have every incentive to do that. If they know that you're getting, especially if you have qualified for special rebates, that they would bump up. It's very hard to know whether they're actually doing that or not, but that's definitely a moral hazard.
I was gonna jump into like I don't know how you measure that or find out who's playing those kind of games, but I completely believe it when the contractor says, here's, you know, the price of the system, and then they show you the line item that they took $500 or $1,000 off from the utility rebate. I mean, I have no idea that they didn't increase the job at the beginning by $500 or $1,000. It makes me feel good that I think I got the rebate, right?
I think it's
I
also
don't know how you would measure that or find that out.
I think it's also an assumption on our part that the rebate's like meant to operate on the consumer and not the contractor. Because if the contractor is really what drives this system, the contractor capturing the rebate isn't necessarily the worst problem.
Also, the utilities are not like, I don't know, I think that there's an interesting conversation with the utilities to be have like it's easier if they work with a limited set of contractors submitting in batches the number of jobs that they did, and they get one check, as opposed to putting the burden on the consumer. All right, now go back to your utility, get them the receipt, prove that this was done, send in the paperwork, then the utility sends you a check. Like, my utility doesn't want to do that. That's a lot of extra work. I don't know how that would how the utilities in Denver would think about that kind of scenario.
How about permit value, Ryan? If you just relate the contractor's rebates, who's receiving them, to the permit value of the homes, because that seems to correlate a lot to income or wealth, isn't it?
You're saying for the rebates or for the not rebates, just generally?
Yeah, because I think part of the motivation of this is to identify who's getting rebates and who's not through the contractor, right?
Yeah.
So what's the group of permit values that each contractor is contracting out for? Is that going to help us? Because so actually, do you know, so for the contractors, you know the total amount of rebates they've gotten? You don't know how many homes got what level of rebates? So you have that information?
So it's a flat rebate in Denver. So it's like 4,000, or one of the years it was 6,000. So assuming that their system costs more than that, and I think that's a pretty safe assumption, it should be a flat dollar value. There's income adjustments to that, and I wouldn't be able to get at that because I just have counts by contractor. So if it's a low income home, they can get a higher dollar value rebate.
And they could get multiple rebates too from state and federal, right?
Yeah, and those we can't get because state and federal rebates, well, state rebates operate via contractors, so I could look for them, but federal rebates are on your taxes, and so those are private.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, I think the benefit of doing Denver is like there's the sales tax to fund these, and so like there's a pretty robust rebate system in practice. Which actually allows us to analyze this in a way that we couldn't for a lot of metro areas, or we couldn't even for like the state of Colorado at this point. Like there's not a rebate program like that in Pueblo, for example. I know people are logging off, so I want to highlight this real quick. On the last slide, if you're like, maybe I'd like to use this data, I'd like to see what it looks like. I made this data view tab. It's just a Google Sheet with like an example of like what some of this permit data looks like. So if you have a great idea of like, oh, could we do this? Like you should be able to look there and say like, hey, this is what actually like shows up in the data. If anyone has questions about what my confusing column titles mean, please reach out. I will happily answer. And then I threw a lot of the code onto GitHub. So if people are like, how in the world is this working? Or like, how could I download permits for another city so that we could build a double project? You could use that as an example. So. And I'm happy to like, if you'd rather be like, no, just send me the shape files or the RDS files, I can send those along as well. So. All right. I want to respect people's time. So any other questions, thoughts?
Brian, it's unrelated, but I have an intern trying to work on finding out information about like building type in environmental justice communities. And I was thinking about the one map that you had at the beginning of your presentation where it looked like where permits were happening and weren't happening. And I'm not familiar again with the Denver area very much, but I was wondering about like environmental justice communities and tying it back to permits and things like that. Something that we're really interested in because we provide energy codes training across the state of Illinois is how to reach harder to reach communities. What are the challenges in environmental justice communities? And I'm wondering if some kind of mapping like this on permits is something that I should be interested in looking at to identify like, are there challenge areas? Is there correlation with environmental justice communities when it comes to permitting?
I think so. I think so. Like Christine's point about like, what are we missing? Like, is everybody getting a permit matters there? Because I think those are the communities that we might expect to use those alternative systems the most. Like that's one thing. I think like my reading on like the urban like Denver literature too is like there's overlapping questions about around like heat islands as well. Like and I think like if you look at this map and you look at like the Denver tree map database and where we expect like greater urban heat island problems, I think there's something to be done there of like, do we see people in do we actually see people in low income communities adopting cooling systems at higher rates than we might expect? Because like the urban system isn't just your house, it's also what's around your house. So I think it's a convoluted question because like Denver's a weird city because like, I moved to Fort Collins now, but like most of my neighbors didn't have AC. And like it's hot in Denver in the summer, and none of them had AC. And that's easy if you have a lot of trees on your street. It's not easy if you don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's something there. I'm not sure which direction it would go as far as like are vulnerable communities doing more of this or less of this. Both of those might be a story.
For sure. Thanks so much. Good research here.
Sure.
Very interesting.
All right. If no one else has things, I will respect your time, hopefully, and enjoy your Friday. And please, if anything comes up, you're like, I'd like to do this, to do this other project, or could we look at this one thing? I would love any questions or thoughts or feedback because I think that's part of the goal of this is how can you use this as well? Like I didn't want to build this just so like I can sit and look at permits all day. So I'm kind of tired of looking at permits. So. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for sharing.
Have a great weekend.
You guys.